You know, today baseball is far fewer people's favorite sport than it used to be. If we were talking about the time from 1898 to 1946, certainly most people's favorite sport would have been baseball. And so the legacy of the Negro leagues and how that fits in with the integration of Major League Baseball, the integration of other sports, the integration of America more generally is a really important story. And so I'm glad to share some ideas today and happy to take some questions along the way as well. So I'm going to go ahead here and share my screen with the PowerPoint that we have. And there we go. So from 1898 to 1946, African Americans played their own brand of baseball in their own leagues and with their own style outside of the white major leagues. They were kept out of Major League Baseball by an unwritten rule, and this kind of works with the same way that we have a lot of discriminatory rules and regulations and even legislation today. There was never a formal rule in the Major League rule book or a resolution by the owners or anything to prohibit the hiring, the use of African-American players in Major League Baseball. Everyone just kind of had agreed not to do it. Doing the history of Negro League Baseball, tracing the history of Negro League Baseball is difficult because they weren't as formally organized. The record-keeping numbers and statistics and box scores and, hitting 400 or 60 home runs or, strikeout records, all of these kinds of rules, winning 300 games, winning 20 games in a season, all of those kinds of statistics are so integral to understanding the sport of baseball and the history of baseball. For the Negro Leagues, we unfortunately don't have those resources in the same way. Box scores were kept irregularly. Maybe some of the African American newspapers, the Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier, which are really vital sources for doing this history and understanding this history, would have some of those records. But we don't have them certainly at the same scale that we have for Major League Baseball. Teams, entire leagues would form and disband in the span of a year or maybe two. And so from the historian's perspective, that makes this challenging, but it also highlights both the resilience and the desire both among the players and the owners, and then also the fans to have baseball and to enjoy the game of baseball when they were barred. African Americans, would be segregated or barred entirely from attending games, as well as from playing in these games. Without getting into the full history of Jim Crow and segregation, the 1896, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision would have, created separate but equal as kind of the formal law of the land, right? That was a Supreme Court decision, and it made it in such a way that segregation was legal, separate but equal. Prior to 1898, there were very few Black players who were competing on integrated teams. But prior to 1898, when Jim Crow and segregation hadn't fully been established, it was possible for African-American players, a handful of African-American players, to play. And some savvy owners recognized that this was a way to expand their audience and their crowds and their gate receipts as well. So if I asked who the first Black major leaguer was, or who's generally thought of the first, most people would give the answer of Jackie Robinson. But actually, if we go back into the 19th century, there's a man, Moses Fleetwood Walker, who was played for Toledo in 1884. He had been a catcher at Oberlin, and Oberlin was one of the very first integrated colleges and universities. founded on the basis of abolitionism back in the 1830s in Ohio. And so Moses Fleetwood Walker played in the majors. Toledo was considered a major league team in 1884. And so as historians have kind of gone back and traced this history more deeply, he has been acknowledged in some ways, at least as the first major leaguer. And we'll spend plenty of time talking about Jackie Robinson and how important his role and his life was in doing this as well. By the late 1880s, African-American teams had sprung up throughout the South, and several northern teams had African-American players on them as well. Certainly not consistent with how much talent there was among African-Americans to play baseball, but there were a few examples. But we also see growing racial hostility. So this is Frank Grant, who played for Buffalo in 1886 and again in 1887. And there's growing racial hostility. We see that in Frank Grant's case because of his teammates refused to have him in the team picture in that 1888 season. Buffalo refuses to resign him in 1889, and so he joins the Cuban Giants, and that's the image that we see here. This picture of him. But again, here he is. Originally played with Buffalo, and then not because of his lack of talent, but simply because of the racial tensions of the time, he's prohibited from playing baseball. The Black migration of the early 20th century of African Americans moved northward in huge numbers, taking on factory jobs, fleeing segregation, moving to major cities like Newark and Patterson, also Chicago, Detroit, Pittsburgh, St. Louis, Kansas City, some of these other American cities. And so not surprisingly, Negro League Baseball grew up around them as well. This is Rube Foster, who was a player and then a manager and also an owner of the Chicago American Giants, which was one of the most successful teams in the Negro Leagues. And Foster created the Negro National League in 1920. And so 1920 to 1950 is really the peak of Negro League Baseball. The Great Depression, as we'll talk about, created some problems, particularly as the overall economic depression of that time period impacted African Americans particularly severely, not unlike the economic challenges that we're seeing today. And if you notice then that 1920 is really considered the peak. This year, the Negro Leagues are celebrating their 100th anniversary. You may have seen there's been a social media campaign of tip your cap to the Negro Leagues, and former presidents from Jimmy Carter, President Bush, President Obama have all participated in this, recorded a short YouTube video. Major League Baseball is going to commemorate the 100th anniversary in August. If we are in fact playing baseball in August, I'm hopeful that we are, although maybe not optimistic. I want to say the date is August 16th. And I think the players are going to be wearing commemorative uniforms to celebrate the 100th anniversary. It's not entirely accurate to say that the Negro League started in 1920, but that's when the Negro National League was formed, and that's kind of the most formal Negro League institution or league that we would have from that time. And so, anything that we can do to draw attention to this history and draw attention to these really tremendous ball players that played, that were kept out of Major League Baseball, out of white baseball, but managed to thrill audiences, apply their trade, and make a living, or sort of make a living, playing baseball. The economics of Black baseball were complicated. Again, African Americans typically had lower incomes, harder work schedules. So the Sunday doubleheader was really the way that Negro League Baseball made their money, and you might have attendance of 4 to as many as 8,000 people for a Sunday doubleheader. And these doubleheaders were not the way that we think of doubleheaders, with 2 teams playing 2 games back to back against each other. You would have 2 teams play one game, and then another 2 teams, a different 2 teams, play the next game. And you see the painting here that captures a Negro League crowd. You see them coming in their Sunday best, and many times these games would be held. The start time would begin after church, and so many families would come directly from church and would be able to go to the game. And of course, as African Americans are getting into manufacturing jobs and the economy is improving overall in the 1920s, you have more African Americans with a little bit of disposable income, limited recreational options because of segregation, and so going to a Negro League game became a way of leisure and an important pastime. And then you also would have barnstorming teams. So you might not be able to have, even for a popular team like the Cuban Giants playing out of New York, playing some of their games in Yankee Stadium, some of their games out of Patterson, that there might not be enough money or enough interest to support a team for playing 40 or 50 or 60 games in a single stadium. And so they would play among multiple stadiums. There was a team, one of the Cuban ex-Giants, that played primarily out of Trenton, but they would also play in Newark, they would play in Atlantic City, they would play in Philadelphia, and in order to kind of get a different audience and a different crowd to attend, to be able to attend these games. The Kansas City Monarchs, which was one of the more famous Negro League teams, was the first team to play at night, and they in fact brought their own lights, but they recognized that with most African Americans working during the day, certainly during the week, and typically 6 days a week in most cases, that really limited the number of fans who could come. But if they could play at night, as major league owners recognize today, there's few things that are a bigger treat for me than a midweek day baseball game, whether I can watch it on TV or simply listen to it while I'm at work, or play hooky for a day or an afternoon and go to the game. But obviously you greatly increase the potential audience if you can play at night. And so the Kansas City Monarchs actually would bring their own lights to increase attendance at their games. The big event of the Negro League season was the annual East-West All-Star Game. Average attendance between 1933 and 1948, the game was typically played in different cities each year, but was over 20,000. And the 1943 game, played in Chicago, attracted more than 51,000 fans. So again, this is 1943 during World War II, but with many African Americans working in war industries and having a higher income, certainly than they had during the Depression, this was a huge draw. And to give you an idea, the Major League Baseball All-Star Game had been played in Philadelphia 2 weeks earlier to a crowd of 32,000 people. So almost 20,000 more fans turned out for the Negro League game than attended the Major League Baseball All-Star Game. And really the economics were such that it was that gate attendance that was necessary for the league to survive throughout the rest of the season. Most athletes who played in the game, and certainly the sports writers, African-American writers for those newspapers and others who covered the game, would consider the quality of play kind of at AAA level, so kind of the highest level of minor league. Certainly there were any number of players who would have been capable of playing in the majors if they had been given the opportunity. But overall, the quality of play, given the limitations and some of the other challenges, was considered AAA, and that's still certainly better baseball than I'll ever play, and certainly better than most of us will ever play. Josh Gibson, who one sports writer called the Black Babe Ruth, and when Babe Ruth was asked about this, he said, well, really, I should be known as the white Josh Gibson. Gibson was a prodigious home run hitter. By all accounts, would have been an all-star in the major leagues. The one story about him is he's the only man known to have hit a fair ball out of Yankee Stadium, old Yankee Stadium, which if you're here, you've probably been to old Yankee Stadium as well, and you know just what kind of a shot that would have been to get the ball all the way out of Yankee Stadium. Black baseball differed from Major League Baseball in some ways. It was more improvisational. You had a lot more stolen bases, more aggressive, and certainly Jackie Robinson, when he came into the league, here's that famous image of him stealing home. Yogi Berra, who I think still believed that he was out to his dying day, but called safe, and Robinson's base running acumen his stolen bases, that aggressiveness, stealing home, embodied Negro League baseball more generally. It has that jazz-like flair and that jazz-like characteristic, a little bit more showmanship, a little bit more aggressive and daring do. New Jersey was a hotbed of Negro League baseball, and at different times there were teams in Newark, Paterson, Trenton, and Atlantic City. And as I said, some of those teams would barnstorm around to some different areas. Many African Americans moving north, particularly from the southeast, would end up in the different cities in New Jersey, which had a thriving manufacturing industry, of course, first part of the 20th century. And that created some relative affluence for African Americans, certainly more than they had experienced in the South. And so when you've got a high concentration of African Americans, and particularly a high concentration of African Americans with making some money, then you're in a good spot for Negro League baseball to endure. So again, this is an image from the Trenton archives from the late 19th century of the original Cuban Giants, as you see there. This was them doing training in St. Augustine, Florida. They would also train in Cuba, but played a lot of their games in the summertime out of Trenton. And of course, Effa Manley, who if technically her husband owned the Newark Eagles, Effa Manley basically ran the team, directed the team, led the team. And the Newark Eagles would win the 1946 Negro League Championship. Joe Louis threw out the first pitch of Game 1. That first pitch was with a special silver ball that also served as the championship trophy. And the one story about that is that Satchel Paige was supposed to pitch Game 7. He was on the Pittsburgh team. And he was scheduled to pitch Game 7, but he also had a barnstorming commitment that started. And so Satchel was going to make more money on the barnstorming tour than in the Negro League Championship. And so he left and wasn't available. Newark would go on to win the championship. And the Satchel Paige All-Stars would more than hold their own against the Bob Feller All-Stars barnstorming that year. Effa Manley would reward her team with special diamond championship rings and a new $15,000 luxury bus. And Effa Manley still is the only woman who is enshrined in the Baseball Hall of Fame. So we have some wonderful connections to Negro League baseball here in, it was the Kansas City Monarchs, not Pittsburgh, I'm sorry. Kansas City Monarchs that Satchel Paige was on, and the Newark Eagles would win in 7 games there. There was a movement a while ago to preserve Hinchcliffe Stadium in Paterson, which is one of the stadiums where the New York Giants Negro League team would play, with Josh Gibson there or the Black Yankees. Getting my team confused. And Josh Gibson would played there in the 1930s and into the 1940s. And I do believe that they managed to preserve the stadium. This is an image from, I think, the Star Ledger website a couple of years ago. So as you can see, it's not really fit for playing, but certainly an important site for recalling Negro League baseball. Many Negro League players would go to Mexico and the Caribbean, where the racial stigma was not the same. And so they could ply their trade down there. And it's really World War II, of course, that begins to change things. African Americans promoted the double V campaign, as they put it: victory over fascism, against Nazi Germany, against Japan abroad, but also victory over segregation and discrimination at home. And so African Americans dedicated themselves to the war effort. They were limited in the military roles that they could play. There were some, but not all of those roles were open to them, but they also played important roles as in part of the arsenal of democracy, the factories and such that were so crucial to America's victory in World War II. And this led to FDR passing the non-discrimination in war industries executive order at the very start of the war. And we get into the coming of integration. Bill Veeck, who, if you know anything about Bill Veeck, he's one of the the great marketers and owners of a variety of different major league teams at this time. And Veeck in 1944 had a plan to buy the Phillies, who were a perennial kind of basement dwelling team. He was going to fire all of the white players and essentially create a Negro League all-star team that would play as the Phillies in 1944. But he was stopped by the other owners and by the commissioner and basically told that would never be allowed to happen. But we can see that things are changing, and certainly that the times are changing, and that leads us appropriately to Jackie Robinson. It's important to note that Jackie Robinson was far more than just a baseball player. At UCLA, he was a star athlete in track, football, and basketball as well as baseball. He was apparently really, really good at tennis too, which shouldn't come as a surprise considering his amazing hand-eye coordination and overall athleticism. But this was a time in America where essentially the only real professional avenue was in baseball. There was football and professional basketball, but it was not nearly as prominent as baseball was, as America's pastime. And also, the financial opportunities would have been far and away the best in baseball. Jackie Robinson served as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army during World War II, and an early event that gets cited a lot in his life is he was on an Army base in 1945. Again, he's a first lieutenant. He gets on a bus. Now, Army bases were not segregated. He's in Texas, so if he had been in Texas, he would have been required to go to the back of the bus under the Jim Crow laws. But on an Army base, he wasn't, and so he refused to go to move. The driver refused to move the bus. The military police were called, and Robinson was actually escorted off of the bus and brought before a court martial, which found that he did not have any wrongdoing. And so we see here, Robinson aware of his rights, eager to serve as a leader and a role model for integration, and someone who wasn't necessarily going to back down. He wasn't someone who was going to come out fighting, but he wasn't someone that was going to back down. So after his honorable discharge from the Army, he was playing for the Kansas City Monarchs in the Negro Leagues, where he played shortstop. Branch Rickey, who at that point had essentially made a decision to bring black players into his Brooklyn Dodgers team. Some of the history around Rickey gets mixed in with myth at this point, but certainly he plays a crucial role. Jackie Robinson could not have integrated baseball alone, although he certainly had the hardest and the most challenging parts of this. And so he had scouts going around to different Negro League teams. He had created the idea that he was looking to create a Negro League team that would play at Ebbets Field when the Dodgers were on the road. And that was the cover that he used in order to be able to scout players to actually bring them onto the Dodgers Major League Baseball team. And so Robinson, in his very first interview with Branch Rickey, Branch Rickey in the middle of that interview really starts berating him, using racial slurs, kind of attacking him. And Robinson, not surprisingly, is a little bit stunned. And he sits there and he finally says, "Mr. Rickey, do you want a ball player who's afraid to fight back?" And Rickey exclaimed, "I want a ball player with guts enough not to fight back." He said, "You've got to do this job with hits and stolen bases and fielding ground balls and nothing else." And that, again, is a sign of the times in 1945, right? This was going to be an opportunity for Jackie Robinson and a really vital one for America. But at the same time, it was going to take the not just the athletic ability, but the proper temperament. Again, Jackie Robinson was not the best known or probably even the most talented player playing baseball in the Negro Leagues in the summer of 1945. But he had the general athleticism, the demeanor. His wife, Rachel Robinson, who I actually had the pleasure to meet at a conference over 25 years ago now, when I was first doing some work on this. All of that would play a vital role in his success, but ultimately it was up to Jackie, and of course he had that balance and did it. Talked about New Jersey's connections to Negro League baseball, but the first integrated baseball game, at least the first integrated, professional game that wasn't a barnstorming game, was played in Jersey City. 1946, Jackie Robinson played with the Montreal Royals, which was the Dodgers AAA farm team. And their home opener, or their opening game, was against the Jersey City Giants in 1946, and April 18th, 1946. And that day, Robinson went 4 for 5 with 4 runs scored, a home run, 4 RBIs, and 2 stolen bases, which is quite a day. And the stadium that day was filled beyond capacity. In 1946, the Dodgers had participated in spring training in Daytona Beach, Florida, where they had gone, but because of the segregation there, the spring training in 1947, the Dodgers had their training in the Dominican Republic, and it was clear in that season that Robinson would be brought up to the major league team. And of course he did. That's not to say that Robinson didn't face considerable racism. There was a player revolt that was quickly put down, led by a center fielder, Dixie Walker, who was traded later that spring training, who basically said all the players should band together and not play if there was going to be a black man on the team. Pee Wee Reese has widely been considered to play a key role in accepting Robinson and showing the rest of the teammates. Reese was from Kentucky himself. Different parts of this story get told and retold, and there might be some controversy around it. But the fact of the matter is that Robinson played for the Dodgers and won the first ever Rookie of the Year award, which was given out there in 1947. Again, to talk about this kind of bringing Negro League baseball style to the majors, Robinson led the league in stolen bases with 29 that year, and the next highest total was 14. So he really set himself apart in that way. But he could hit, he could field, while putting up with all manner of racism and still having to not always being able to stay in the same team hotel. If in places like St. Louis and some of the other cities that were segregated, Robinson had to stay elsewhere and couldn't stay with his teammates. But on the field, Robinson could challenge whites in a manner that would have been really dangerous to do anywhere else, right? I mean, just the fact of committing to a stolen base, the fact of getting a hit off of a white pitcher, focuses on, are African Americans really inferior? And every time that Robinson and then the other black players that would follow him into the major leagues did that, whether it's striking out, a black pitcher striking out a white player, or a black player getting a hit, stealing a base, getting a home run, scoring a run off of a white team, they're putting lie to segregation and to a lot of the ideas that had long been accepted in America. So he wins the Rookie of the Year in 1947. 1949, and this was my very first grad school paper, the Dodgers returned to spring training in Florida, and as most of the Major League Baseball teams did, there wasn't Atlanta didn't have a team yet, but they would kind of barnstorm their way north at the end of spring training, coming up to New York or Chicago or wherever they were going for the start of the Major League season. And so the Dodgers they had scheduled a 3-game series in Atlanta on a Friday, Saturday, Sunday, coming north from Florida. And by that time, the team featured not just Jackie Robinson, but Roy Campanella was on that team. Joe Black was a pitcher on that team as well. And so this was the first integrated baseball game in the South, and certainly in Atlanta. When the schedule was announced, there was a huge outcry. The Klan actually organized protests and rallies against it. The Georgia legislature tried to pass a law that prohibited interracial sports competition. But the game itself was a huge success. Robinson played all 3 games, and the attendance on the Sunday game, again, Sundays being key for African Americans to be able to attend, was the highest attendance ever for a game at Old Ponce de Leon Park in Atlanta. So African American fans are voting with their money and supporting integrated baseball. Larry Doby, who had played for Newark, was the first African American in the American League. Bill Veeck had bought the Cleveland Indians, and although he was thwarted in creating a black all-star team, he brought in the best African-American players that he could find, namely Satchel Paige, as well as Larry Doby. Monty Irvin is another Negro League player that Effa Manley really believed would be the first black major leaguer. He was more of a true ball player than Robinson, who was more of an overall athlete. But Robinson, of course, got the chance. But both Larry Doby and Monty Irvin would excel as well as stars in Major League Baseball. Satchel Paige is still the oldest rookie to ever play in the majors. He would have been in the majors if they had been desegregated, much younger, of course. But he makes his rookie debut in the major leagues at the age of 42. And he would be the first Negro League player, of course, in the Hall of Fame when he was added in 1971. Satchel Paige, the stories are endless. He would call in his outfielders and tell them to go ahead and spend the inning on the bench. He wasn't going to need them because he was going to strike everybody out. That 1948 season, Satchel Paige pitching at the old Memorial Stadium in Cleveland in front of 78,000 fans. That place was huge. Pitched the Indians to a 1-0 record, a 1-0 victory over the White Sox, and that attendance of more than 78,000 still is a game record for baseball. That still stands. For Paige, you could see how he was as much an entertainer as a sportsman, and I think in some ways probably anticipates our current day. And so Jackie Robinson integrating baseball, the success of Monty Irvin and Larry Doby, Satchel Paige, and the other African-American stars that would come along was tremendously important. But it also leads to the demise of the Negro Leagues. African-American fans were excited to see their stars, their heroes play in Major League Baseball, and attendance drops, interest in the Negro Leagues drop as the focus is on the black players in the majors and seeing those black players succeed against other white athletes. In most instances, Negro League teams did not have formal contracts. We talked about kind of the ad hoc nature of those teams and of those leagues. And so teams didn't get any compensation for the first couple of years if a major league team signed one of their players. Later on, this was standardized, but even then it was kind of a modest sum of, you would have to pay $5,000 to get, the talent of a black major leaguer added to your team. To pay the Negro League team that he had formerly played for. And at the same time, teams are the Negro League teams and the Negro League owners are coming under pressure to let those players go and play in Major League Baseball, to show it wasn't just Jackie Robinson, but that there was a whole host of black ball players that could succeed in the major leagues. As Effa Manley said, we couldn't have stopped them, nor should we have. And she recognized how important this was, and that there was a tremendous benefit, and this was tremendously important to America as a whole. But this also, here we talk about the lack of compensation. This talks about the larger tensions of African American life in America at this time, right? This is still several years before the Brown versus Board of Education decision that would begin the process of desegregating schools, public schools in America, a process that's still ongoing. In 1955, you have fewer African Americans making a living in baseball, either playing baseball, managing a baseball team, owning a baseball team. The Negro Leagues were among the very most successful African-American owned businesses in the first half of the 20th century in America. And by 1955, they were essentially all gone. And that opportunity for those athletes was a tremendously important one, but for the economy that existed as part of the Negro Leagues, that was gone. And all of a sudden, all of that money of black fans was going to white owners and going to white teams and going to those stadiums and away from African-American owned businesses. at the same time, we know the superstars, the Satchel Paige, the Jackie Robinsons, that are in the Hall of Fame. But we also know how difficult it was for Black players of a similar talent level to get a chance in the majors. So this chart here uses one of those Nouveau statistics called win shares, and so this is the percentage of Black players, and you see that their win share, so the amount they're contributing to their team's success is in excess of their percentage in the league. And so basically what this illustrates is that Black players had to be more talented than white players in order to get their opportunity to play in the majors. And so this just kind of, a white player and a Black player of equal talent, the white player was going to get the benefit of the doubt every time, or at least almost every time. And so that's just another way that we see the persistence of this discrimination. This is back to 2016, but these numbers, the specific numbers may have changed a little bit, but in general, you've only got 8% of major leaguers are African American. You see predominantly in the outfield, only 3% of pitchers are African American, 7 starters and 7 relievers here for the 2016 season. But again, we've seen overwhelmingly how African American players are pursuing other sports. This chart shows the racial breakdown of different sports, and so we see that there's actually even more African Americans playing MLS. I think this is 2017 or 2018 data. But it was surprising to me when I saw that there's actually more African Americans playing soccer even than are playing baseball. And we see, almost 80% of the NBA, almost 70% of the NFL is African American, and over 70% of the women's NBA, the WNBA, as well. So this continues to be a problem. African Americans are drawn to other sports. In some cases, they're pigeonholed into other sports. Baseball is an expensive sport to play as a kid. My son's now almost 15, but playing travel baseball and getting those opportunities is not cheap, and it takes a lot of space, right? Basketball, even football, you can play with kind of a minimum amount of equipment, right? If you've got a ball, if you've got a football, you can play football. If you've got a basketball and a hoop, or preferably 2, but at least 1, then you can play basketball. You don't need as much space as you need to play baseball. And so in urban areas and inner city areas that don't have that kind of park space, African Americans are not surprisingly going to move in that direction, and those sports require less equipment. I mean, it's, hockey's not on this chart, but it would be comparable too, where hockey takes a lot of expensive equipment to play, to get ice time, to get involved in teams, and to play at those high levels. But at the same time, if we think about what Major League Baseball would look like without minority players whatsoever, at this point we see, according to this chart, and again, these numbers have probably only increased, maybe as much as a third of Major League Baseball has Latino players. Asian players have made small inroads as well, but a lot of them are prominent. And again, that same sense that you have to be kind of particularly talented as an Asian player, but not facing the same discriminatory issues that African American players would be facing. Most famously, Jackie Robinson's number 42 retired. Whenever I give this talk in New Jersey, I of course think that Mariano Rivera, and I am not a Yankee fan, but I was a Mariano Rivera fan. He was the last player in the majors to wear 42. So in 1997, when they made that announcement on the 50th anniversary of Robinson integrating baseball, that his number would be retired throughout baseball, I always thought that was kind of a cool thing. April 15th, now Major League Baseball typically celebrates Jackie Robinson Day, and now basically every player wears 42 for that day, which can make it hard to figure out who's playing, but is just a wonderful acknowledgement of Jackie Robinson and of the integration of baseball more generally.